However, the words of the Messiah carry more weight than the words of the Apostle Paul. And as we have already stated in previous teachings, if anything that Paul has written or taught contradicts what Yeshua said, then the problem is not with the text, friend. It is with our interpretation, because Paul is in harmony with the teachings of Yeshua. If not, we have to declare him a heretic, and he is not. But for the purpose of context, we're going to read Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20. So let's read Matthew 5, 17, where we read, "Don't think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all things are accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches these commands will be great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never get into the kingdom of heaven." Now, as with any study of Scripture, context is crucial to gaining a proper understanding of what we are reading and attempting to interpret. And this text certainly is no different. There are also several other things to consider, such as the historical, cultural, geographical, visual, linguistic, and literary context. All of those things are important to consider when you're attempting to gain an understanding of the ancient text of Scripture. And now, as most of you know, the Bible was not originally written in English, but in Hebrew, Greek, and some Aramaic. So, the context of such things as language, culture, history, the original audience, and so on, all factors into properly understanding any text of Scripture that we may be attempting to interpret. And so today, I want to begin with the common interpretation of this text. Now, if you've been involved with the study of the Scripture, any at all, you've likely heard the common interpretation of this text, which is generally stated something like, well, Jesus came and fulfilled the law. We don't need to keep the law. We are under grace now. The law was bondage, and no one could keep it, so Jesus came and he delivered us from it. He nailed it to the cross. Now, this is the common or the general understanding of this text in the modern day mainstream church. But is this, in fact, what Yeshua is saying here in this text? Is he really teaching his followers not to obey the law of Moses, the Torah? So let's test this common interpretation and understanding of this text, and let's ask ourselves if this interpretation makes sense based on the immediate context and the overall context of Scripture. So let's first begin by understanding that Yeshua is setting the tone for his ministry. Now, Yeshua begins here by making a statement that will set the context for all that he will say throughout the remainder of his sermon, which concludes at the end of chapter 7, and really all that he'll teach and practice throughout all of his earthly ministry, really. But let's begin by looking at the first statement of Yeshua when he says, "Don't think." Okay? In Matthew 5:17, he says, "Don't think that I came to abolish the law or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill." Now, most of us, we've likely heard this text read from the more well-known King James Version of the Bible, which states, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets." Now, if one were to read this at face value, one would think that Yeshua is saying, stop thinking that I come to destroy the law and the prophets. However, when you read this in the Greek, you realize that it is written in what is known as the aorist tense, meaning that he is really saying, don't even begin to think. And so based on the chronological order and the context, if you think about it, this really makes sense, because this is in Matthew chapter 5 and is Yeshua's first sermon, meaning this is at the beginning of his ministry. And so it would make much more sense for him to tell them, don't begin to think this is what I've come to do at the beginning of his ministry rather than later on. And so he's appealing to what is known as the Deuteronomy 13 test. And this was the standard by which a prophet would have been tested. So let's go read Deuteronomy 13, beginning at verse 1 to have some context of what we're talking about here. So Deuteronomy 13, verse 1, we read, "If a prophet or someone who has dreams arises among you and proclaims a sign or a wonder to you, and that sign or wonder he has promised you comes about, but he says, 'Let's follow other mighty ones, which you have not known, and let's worship them.' Now listen to this, verse 3. Do not listen to that prophet's words or to that dreamer, for Yahweh your Elohim is testing you to know whether you love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart and with all your soul. You must follow Yahweh your Elohim and fear him. You must keep his commands and listen to him. You must worship him and remain faithful to him. That prophet or dreamer must be put to death because he urged rebellion against Yahweh your Elohim, who brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the place of slavery, to turn you from the way Yahweh your Elohim has commanded you to walk. You must purge the evil from you." Now, this was the standard by which a prophet was tested in the time of Yeshua and prior to. Now, Yeshua, he's letting his audience know that he's not a false prophet according to Deuteronomy 13, who has come to lead them away from Yahweh and his teachings, which is what Deuteronomy 13 says that a false prophet will do. Now, this is why even Paul was in agreement with the stoning of Stephen in Acts chapter 7, verses 54 through 60, because as far as he knew, based on the evidence presented to him, Stephen failed the Deuteronomy 13 test. Now, we know that he wasn't a false prophet, but at the time, Paul didn't know that.